Have you ever been in the middle of a conversation with someone and just stopped? Not because you ran out of things to say, because you realized it doesn't matter. They're not going to hear you. You can explain it as clearly as you want. They're going to get louder or shut down completely or repeat the exact same point, like volume is somehow a substitute for evidence. And eventually, you land on the most obvious explanation. This person just doesn't have the mental capacity to process what I'm saying. But what if that's wrong? What if everything we call signs of low intelligence, the black and white thinking, the defensiveness, the unshakable certainty, has nothing to do with how smart someone is? Because researchers have a clinical name for that binary thinking. It's called splitting, and it's a defense mechanism, something a nervous system produces under threat. The defensiveness when someone gets criticized. That's shame dysregulation, documented in neuroscience. The refusal to update a belief. That's identity protective cognition, a pattern that, according to Yale research, actually runs stronger in people with higher cognitive ability, not lower. We're going through all 7 of those behaviors today, and for each one, we're showing you what's actually happening in the brain. By the end of this, at least one is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. The person who cannot, seemingly will not, acknowledge that anything is complicated. To them, you're either completely right or completely wrong. The information is either totally true or a total lie. There's no gray. There's no nuance. Just 2 boxes, and everything gets forced into one of them. That looks like a cognitive limitation. It sounds like one. But there's a clinical term for it, and the term isn't low IQ. It's called splitting. Splitting is a defense mechanism, something your nervous system produces, not something your IQ determines. The concept has roots in psychoanalytic theory going back to the 1940s, and it's been studied extensively in trauma research since. The basic mechanism is this: holding 2 contradictory ideas simultaneously. This person I love also hurt me. This belief I've held might actually be wrong. Requires significant prefrontal cortex activity. It's metabolically expensive. It's cognitively demanding. And when a brain is under enough threat, it conserves resources by collapsing complexity. Black and white isn't stupidity. It's efficiency under pressure. It's a stressed nervous system doing exactly what stressed nervous systems do. Here's the part that actually matters. Splitting isn't exclusive to people with diagnosed trauma histories. Research shows it exists on a spectrum. Any brain, under enough emotional threat, with enough at stake, can default to binary processing. The capacity isn't gone. The system is just in protection mode. Think about the last time you were in a genuinely heated argument. Not a calm disagreement, an actual fight. Were you carefully holding the complexity of both sides? Or did the other person start to feel like the problem? Entirely, completely, no exceptions. That's not a character flaw. That's a nervous system managing perceived threat. The difference between you and the person who seems permanently stuck in splitting isn't cognitive capacity. It's activation threshold. And that's a completely different problem than the one you thought you were looking at. But the next behavior is the one everyone's most confident is proof of low IQ. And the science behind it? Genuinely a mess. That unearned confidence. The person who knows almost nothing about a topic and talks about it like they wrote the textbook. The one who's somehow never been wrong. Who, the less they actually know, the more certain they seem. Most videos on this topic cite the same study to explain this. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Cornell, 1999. The finding: people who scored lowest on tests of logic and grammar consistently overestimated how well they'd done. And the conclusion that got copy-pasted across the entire internet was, low performers literally lack the mental equipment to recognize their own incompetence. Except in 2020, a paper published in the peer-reviewed journal Intelligence argued that the original findings are primarily a statistical artifact, a predictable mathematical outcome called regression to the mean, not a real psychological phenomenon. When researchers applied more appropriate methods, the effect either disappeared or shrank to a size that calls its real-world meaningfulness into serious question. That doesn't mean overconfidence isn't real. It absolutely is. But the actual explanation is more interesting and considerably more uncomfortable. Yale researcher Dan Kahan spent years studying what he called identity-protective cognition. His finding: people don't reject contradictory information because they lack the intelligence to process it. They reject it because accepting it would cost them something real: their group, their status, their sense of who they are. The brain treats a challenge to a core belief the same way it treats a physical threat. And here's the part that actually unsettles people. Kahan found this pattern doesn't weaken with higher intelligence. In some contexts, it runs stronger. A smarter person can construct a more sophisticated defense of what they already believe. The brain isn't failing, it's protecting. Which raises a question nobody's asking about the next behavior, and it might be the most personally recognizable one yet. There's a behavior that sits right underneath identity-protective cognition, powering it quietly. The inability to separate how something feels from whether it's actually true. You've seen this. Someone receives a piece of information that contradicts what they believe, and instead of engaging with the content, they respond to how it made them feel. The information feels like an attack, so they treat it as an attack. The idea makes them uncomfortable, so they conclude the idea is wrong. Their emotional response becomes the evidence. Most people watching someone do this read it as a reasoning failure, a sign their brain can't handle complexity. But psychologist Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, identified this exact pattern back in the 1970s. He called it emotional reasoning, and it's one of the most well-documented cognitive distortions in clinical psychology. It appears consistently in anxiety disorders, not as a feature of low intelligence. When your nervous system perceives a threat, and a challenge to your beliefs absolutely registers as a threat. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux's research shows that the signal reaches your amygdala faster than conscious thought. Before your rational brain even begins to process what's happening, your threat system has already started shaping the response. Your prefrontal cortex is being suppressed before it even gets a say. In that state, feelings aren't just feelings anymore. They're the most immediate data your brain has access to. Of course they become evidence. That's not irrationality. That's what cognition looks like when the threat system is running the show. Think back to the last time someone told you something that felt deeply unfair, even if part of you knew they might be right. Your first response wasn't calm evaluation. You felt something first. And for at least a moment, that feeling was your reality. That's emotional reasoning. And it didn't happen because your intelligence failed you. Which brings us to the behavior that looks the most aggressive from the outside. The one that seems like pure ego and zero self-awareness. But what's actually driving it is something the nervous system has been doing since long before language existed. There's a behavior that follows emotional reasoning almost every time, and it's the one that stops conversations faster than anything else. The person who stops reasoning and starts performing gets louder, more forceful, repeats the exact same point they already made, not because they haven't heard you, but because from inside their nervous system, the goal has completely shifted. This isn't a debate anymore. It's a threat response. When the amygdala is running the show, and it fires before the rational brain even knows what's happening, the nervous system enters what researchers call the threat response spectrum: fight, flight, or freeze. Most arguments don't produce flight or freeze, they produce fight. And fight, at the behavioral level, looks like escalation, louder, more insistent, more forceful. Here's the specific part nobody explains. Working memory, the cognitive workspace you use to generate new arguments, consider counterpoints, form fresh responses, gets significantly consumed by threat processing. You're using so much mental bandwidth managing the threat signal that there's genuinely less available to produce anything new. So the brain does what it always does under resource constraints: amplifies what's already there. Same point, more intensity. Volume is a substitution behavior. It's what a nervous system produces when it can't access the reasoning it needs, So it does the only thing left, tries to overwhelm rather than persuade. That's not a cognitive limitation. That's a system under load. And here's the uncomfortable version of that. Think about the last time you genuinely needed someone to understand something and they just weren't getting it. Did you get quieter and more precise? Or did something else start to happen? That pull towards escalation you felt, that's the same system, running the same code. The behavior that might actually cost people the most, in relationships, in careers, in every conversation that matters, is the next one. And the reason it happens has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with something the brain experiences as a threat to its own survival. Here's the exact moment a conversation goes from frustrating to genuinely confusing. You're not even attacking anyone. You're presenting information, calmly, reasonably, with evidence. And somehow the other person treats it like you just walked into their house and insulted their family. The defensiveness is instant. The hostility is completely out of proportion. And it feels irrational because from where you're standing, nothing threatening happened. But from inside their nervous system, something extremely threatening happened. There's a distinction in psychology that explains this better than anything else. The difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. And while guilt keeps the door open to adjusting and learning, shame does the exact opposite. It triggers a survival response. When the brain reads incoming information as evidence of personal defectiveness, not my belief was wrong, but I am wrong. I am fundamentally the problem. The amygdala processes that the same way it processes physical danger. Brain imaging research confirms that shame activates the brain's threat circuitry. Rational processing suppresses, defensive systems come online. And when shame dysregulates fully, the brain doesn't fold. It attacks. Researchers call it overcompensation. The hostility, the pivot to you're the problem, the sudden counterattack that seems to come from nowhere? That's not aggression for its own sake. That's a nervous system trying to neutralize an existential threat. The person isn't angry because you gave them information they couldn't process. They're dysregulated because their brain read your correction as an announcement that they are defective. And defectiveness at the level of identity isn't an inconvenience. It's a threat to survival. You're not talking to someone who evaluated the evidence and chose to reject it. You're talking to someone whose threat system is running the show. One last mechanism before the one that changes how you look at this entire list. And it might be the quietest one because it doesn't look like a threat response at all. It looks like someone who just doesn't care enough to think ahead. This next one might be the most misread of all because it looks less like emotional dysregulation and more like pure intellectual failure. The inability to think ahead, to trace a current disaster back to the decision that caused it, to visualize what happens 3 steps from now before making a move today. From the outside, this looks like the most textbook definition of low intelligence there is. Abstract thinking, long-term planning, cause and effect. These are supposed to be the things that separate sophisticated cognition from reactive, impulsive behavior. Except, here's what the research actually shows. In 2013, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science that quietly upended how we think about this. They found that when people were under significant financial stress, not poverty as a permanent state, but the active cognitive experience of not having enough, they performed substantially worse on tests of abstract reasoning and planning. Not because their intelligence had changed, because the mental bandwidth required to manage immediate threat had left almost nothing available for everything else. The researchers estimated the performance drop was equivalent to losing a full night of sleep, or 13 IQ points. Same brain, different conditions. And Amy Arnstein's research at Yale on prefrontal cortex function showed that even mild, uncontrollable stress causes rapid suppression of the exact region responsible for planning, abstract thinking, and connecting current decisions to future consequences. The prefrontal cortex isn't just involved in those functions, it is those functions. When it goes offline, the brain can only do what it can see directly in front of it. That person who seems to never learn from their mistakes, who keeps ending up in the same situation they just left, there's a real chance they're not failing to think ahead because they lack the capacity. They're failing to think ahead because every available cognitive resource is being consumed by whatever threat their nervous system is currently managing. One last behavior on this list. It's the only one nobody ever turns around on themselves. The seventh behavior is the one this video has been pointing toward, and the reason nobody names it is that it's invisible from the inside. Psychologists call it the bias blind spot. Research by Emily Pronin and colleagues at Stanford found that people consistently rate themselves as less affected by cognitive biases than others, even when those biases have just been explained to them in detail. The behavior? Seeing these patterns in other people clearly, accurately, immediately, while the same patterns operate in you completely undetected. That's not a character flaw. It's a documented structural feature of self-perception. And it means that everything in this video has probably been applied, very naturally, very automatically, to someone specific in your life. Here's where we have to be honest with each other. Because this entire video, the binary thinking, the unearned confidence, the emotional reasoning, the volume, the hostility, the inability to see past the immediate moment, we've been framing all of it as something that happens in other people. And maybe that's why you're still watching. Because understanding the mechanism feels useful. It gives you language. It helps you make sense of someone frustrating in your life. But every single one of these behaviors is a threat response. And your nervous system produces threat responses too. Not only occasionally, and not only when things get extreme. The research on amygdala activation, on prefrontal cortex suppression, on shame dysregulation, on identity protective cognition, none of it specifies a type of person this applies to. It describes what human brains do under conditions of sufficient threat. That includes yours. That includes mine. Think about the last time someone challenged something you genuinely cared about. A belief, a decision you'd already made, your parenting, your relationship, your politics. Did you move toward the complexity, or did some part of you simplify it quickly, automatically, before you even realized it was happening? Think about the last time you were certain about something and turned out to be wrong. How long did it take you to update? Was there a moment where the new information felt more like an attack than a correction? Think about the last time you got louder in an argument instead of clearer. None of that makes you the person this video was supposedly about. It does mean something important, though. The line between a nervous system in protection mode and a nervous system in reasoning mode is not a line between people. It's a line between states, and every one of us crosses it. The person who seems permanently stuck in these behaviors isn't built differently than you. They're just stuck in a threat state you can exit, and they currently can't. That's worth sitting with. Not because it excuses the behavior, but because it changes what the behavior actually means. You didn't come here to feel superior. Or maybe you did, a little. Most of us do. But the most useful thing this framework gives you isn't a way to judge people more accurately. It's a way to catch yourself earlier, to notice when your own reasoning is running on threat instead of clarity, to recognize the moment your threat system is running the show and decide whether you want to stay there. That's not a small thing. We started this video with a frustrating person, someone who couldn't see gray areas, couldn't take feedback, couldn't back down even when they were clearly wrong. And the question underneath it all was, what's actually happening in there? Now you know. It's not a hardware problem. It's a threat response. An amygdala that fires before you even know it's happening. A brain doing exactly what stressed brains do. That doesn't make the behavior okay, but it makes it legible. And there's a real difference between those two things. Here's the one thing worth carrying out of this. The behaviors you came here to understand in someone else are the same behaviors worth learning to recognize in yourself, early, before they've already run. If that reframe landed, subscribe. There's a lot more where that came from.